They may not have had the complete written Bible like we do today, but they clearly understood some of the core principles of God's character and his plan.
It challenges our assumptions about the Old Testament, doesn't it? These weren't people just stumbling around in spiritual darkness.
No.
They were wrestling with some pretty profound theological truths, even without the written scriptures that we have today.
Absolutely. And Job's story, in particular, really highlights this reality of the invisible world and its impact on our lives.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about that.
Okay.
We've got these two worlds, right?
Right.
The visible world, the one we experience with our senses, and then the invisible world, the spiritual realm, where God and spiritual beings, dwell.
And what Job's story so beautifully illustrates is that those two worlds are interconnected.
Okay.
What happens in the spiritual realm directly impacts our experiences in the physical world, even if we don't even realize it's happening.
That's a powerful concept.
It is.
So are you saying there's more to reality than just what we can see and touch? That there are spiritual forces at work that can influence our lives in ways we might not understand?
Exactly. Think about Job's suffering.
Oh.
He had no clue about the cosmic wager going on between God and Satan.
Right.
The spiritual battle that was raging behind the scenes. He was just living his life, trying to be faithful, and suddenly, bam, everything's taken from him.
It's like he was caught in the crossfire of a war he didn't even know was happening.
Exactly. And this brings us to another point that Ed Miller really emphasizes. Man's futile attempts to explain these mysteries of life without acknowledging the spiritual dimension at all.
Yeah. We see that play out with Job's friends, right?
Oh, absolutely.
They come up with all these explanations for his suffering.
Right.
Trying to fit it into their, neat little theological boxes.
Right.
But ultimately, their explanations just fall flat.
Yeah, they become those miserable comforters, as Job calls them.
Right.
Offering advice that's more about placing blame than providing any real comfort or understanding.
And isn't it interesting how that kind of reflects our own tendencies sometimes?
Yeah.
We often try to find explanations for our struggles in all the wrong places. Focusing on the physical, the material, and neglecting that spiritual dimension altogether.
It's human nature, right? To seek answers within the realm of our own limited understanding.
Yeah.
But Job's story, it teaches us that true understanding can only be found in God.
Right.
He holds the key to unlocking those mysteries of life, the one who sees the bigger picture.
And that's why the book begins and ends with God, right?
Yes.
It's a powerful reminder that he is the ultimate source of wisdom and truth.
Absolutely.
Even when things just seem so confusing or unjust.
It's just true.
But I think it's time to take a break.
Yeah.
We'll come back in part 2 and explore the climax of Job's story, his encounter with the divine.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Job.
When we left off, we were talking about how Job's friends, they tried to explain his suffering.
Right.
But they weren't really taking the spiritual dimension into account.
Yeah, they were looking for answers in all the wrong places.
Right.
But then God himself, he steps onto the scene.
Okay.
And it's not exactly a quiet entrance.
Oh, really?
Ed Miller actually describes it as God answering Job from a tornado.
Wow. Okay, so what does God actually say to Job after all this silence? Does he finally give Job the answers he's been looking for?
Well, not really in the way that Job might have expected.
Oh.
Instead of giving him this simple explanation, God responds with a bunch of questions.
Oh, wow.
72 to be exact.
72 questions.
And these aren't just any questions,
Right.
They're designed to challenge Job's limited perspective.
Okay.
Force him to confront, just the vastness of God's wisdom and power.
So instead of giving Job a direct answer, God uses questions to kind of guide him towards a deeper understanding.
Exactly. It's like God is saying, Job, you think you really understand what's going on here. You think you can actually grasp all the complexities of my creation and my plan.
Right.
Let me ask you a few things.
Oh, wow.
And the questions themselves are, mind-blowing.
Yeah.
They delve into the mysteries of the universe, the wonders of nature, the sheer intricacies of creation.
Right.
Things that even today, with all our scientific advancements, we're still trying to, wrap our heads around.
Yeah, it sounds like God's giving Job and us this glimpse into his cosmic workshop,
Yeah.
showing us the scale and the complexity of what he's orchestrating behind the scenes.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And when faced with this just overwhelming display of divine wisdom and power, all of Job's complaints and accusations they just fade away.
All right.
He realizes how audacious it was
Yeah.
to even question God, the creator of all things.
So Job goes from demanding answers to realizing he doesn't even know the right questions to ask.
Exactly. And there's this really humbling moment
Yeah.
where Job says, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted.
Wow.
It's this profound shift in perspective, right?
Right.
He moves from demanding these answers to acknowledging God's sovereignty, accepting that his ways are simply beyond our full comprehension.
You know, this reminds me of something that Ed Miller says
What's that?
about the importance of just trusting in God's plan even when we don't get it.
Right.
He says Job's story isn't just about finding the answers, but about deepening our relationship with God through this whole process of, questioning and seeking.
That's such a key point.
Yeah.
It's not about God giving Job a point-by-point explanation for his suffering,
Right.
but about revealing just the vastness of who he is.
Okay.
It's not about satisfying Job's curiosity, but about expanding his understanding of God's character
Right.
and the scope of his creation.
Okay, so what happens next? How does this all end?
Well, first, God rebukes Job's friends
Oh, right.
for their misguided counsel.
He does.
Oh, yeah. He affirms that Job, even in all his pain and confusion, actually spoke more rightly about God than they did with their tidy little explanations.
It's like God saying, look, you guys tried to shove Job's experience into this box of your limited understanding.
Yeah.
But Job, with his raw honesty, has actually grasped more of my truth than all of you have.
Exactly. And then God restores Job's fortune,
Okay.
blessing him with even more than he had before.
He does.
Oh, yeah. Double the livestock, new family, long and prosperous life.
That's amazing. That's a beautiful picture of God's grace and redemption,
It is.
He doesn't just vindicate Job, but he showers him with blessings beyond measure.
It's important to remember, though, that the restoration of those physical blessings, that's not really the main point of the story.
It isn't.
No. It's about this transformation that happens inside Job's heart.
Oh.
It's about his understanding of God.
So it's not about getting back what was lost, but gaining something much more valuable.
Yes.
A deeper relationship with God.
Exactly. Job's story reminds us that sometimes God lets us go through these tough times.
Right.
Not to punish us,
Right.
but to refine us, to deepen our faith, and to bring us closer to him.
And even though we may never fully understand the reasons behind our suffering, the why,
Yeah.
we can trust that God is somehow working all things together for our good.
And for his glory.
Absolutely. Job's story really encourages us to hold on to hope. Even when we're faced with overwhelming trials, knowing that God is in control and his purposes are good.
That's so important to remember.
Yeah, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, what stood out to you the most from this part of Job's story?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think what really struck me was the way God uses questions instead of just giving answers
Yeah.
to lead Job to a deeper understanding.
Right.
It's this powerful reminder that sometimes the process of searching and questioning, that's just as important as finding the actual answers.
Absolutely. It makes you think about how we approach God, right?
Right.
Are we coming to him just demanding answers? Or are we open to being, challenged and transformed by his questions?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's definitely something I'll be thinking about as we continue.
Me too.
In the next part, we'll explore some of the key takeaways from Job's story and how they apply to our lives today. Welcome back to our deep dive into Job. Exploring this ancient text with Ed Miller's study guide, it's really been eye-opening.
It is amazing, isn't it? How a book written so long ago can still be so relevant today.
Yeah. One thing that I keep thinking about is Job as this, model for understanding God's love for everyone.
It's easy to get stuck thinking that in the Old Testament, God was only focused on the Israelites.
Right.
The Job story, as Ed Miller points out, really blows that idea out of the water.
Yeah, here's this Gentile guy living outside of the covenant community, and he has this incredible faith and understanding of God.
And it really rivals or even surpasses that of a lot of Israelites.
It does, really challenges those assumptions about who God is and how he works.
It shows us that God's love has no limits.
Yeah.
It extends to everyone who seeks him, no matter their background or ethnicity or religion.
That's such an important message, especially in a world that feels so divided these days.
It is.
But before we go too far, let's get back to something we talked about earlier, this idea of the invisible world and how it impacts our lives.
Ah, yes, the invisible world. Job's story really reminds us that there's more to reality than what we see. There's this whole spiritual dimension where God and spiritual beings exist, and it influences everything in our physical world.
And like we saw with Job, we're not always aware of what's going on in that realm, are we?
No, not at all.
He had no idea about that whole wager between God and Satan, that spiritual battle.
Right.
All he knew were the consequences, playing out in his life.
It's a pretty sobering thought.
It is.
To think that we could be caught in the middle of a spiritual war that we can't even see.
And that's where faith comes in, I guess.
Exactly.
Ed Miller talks about how even though Job is suffering and he's confused, he never gives up on God.
He does.
He keeps wrestling with him, keeps asking those questions and seeking God.
And that's what gets him through it all.
Yeah, it's like a powerful example of how faith isn't about having all the answers, right?
Right.
It's about trusting God, his
Right.
character, his plan,
Yeah.
even when we don't understand what's going on.
Even when it doesn't make sense.
Right. And speaking of trusting God's plan, there's something really fascinating that Ed Miller points out about how this whole story ends.
Oh, yeah.
He says that even though God restores Job's fortunes in the end, that's not really the point of the story.
That's such a good point. It's so easy to just focus on that happy ending.
It is.
Everything being restored outwardly.
Yeah.
But the real change happens in Job's heart.
Okay.
He comes to this new, deeper understanding of God.
So it's not about getting back what was lost, it's about gaining something way more valuable.
Exactly. That relationship with God.
Right. Job's story reminds us that sometimes God allows us to go through difficult things, not to punish us,
Right.
but to actually refine us to make our faith stronger.
And draw us closer to Him.
It's like those really tough workouts at the gym,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It hurts in the moment, but it makes you stronger in the end.
And just like a good trainer wouldn't give you a workout you couldn't handle, God won't give us more than we can take.
Right. He's always there, giving us the strength to get through it.
That's a great point.
It reminds me of something else Ed Miller brings up about recognizing our own limits and acknowledging God's power and control over everything.
After all those mind-blowing questions from God, Job realizes how prideful he'd been, and he humbles himself and repents.
That's a really powerful part of the story, isn't it?
It is.
It shows how going through tough times can actually lead to spiritual growth.
It can.
It can show us those blind spots in our hearts where we need to surrender to God.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about enduring suffering. It's about letting God use it to shape us.
To shape us into who He wants us to be.
Yeah, and that process of transformation, of letting go of our own limited understanding, embracing God's wisdom and His plan.
That's what leads to real peace and joy, even in the midst of trials.
This deep dive into Job has been amazing.
It has.
It's really challenged me, helped me understand God better, and given me a new way to look at suffering and how to face it with faith.
I think it's a journey we can keep coming back to,
You do.
Each time we read Job's story, I think we'll find new insights and new ways that God is speaking to us.
That's a great point.
I think so.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with this thought.
Okay.
Don't just read Job's story. Really engage with it.
Yeah.
Wrestle with those tough questions. Let yourself be challenged by God's word.
Let it change you.
And remember, even in those darkest moments, God's light is still there, guiding us towards a future filled with His grace and redemption.
Beautifully said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the book of Job. We hope it's encouraged you to keep exploring God's word and finding those gems of wisdom.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Welcome to our